Discover the Zhou Dynasty, China's longest-lasting dynasty. The Zhou Dynasty was a royal dynasty of China from 1046 BC until 256 BC and followed the Shang dynasty. The Zhou was the longest surviving dynasty in China, lasting a total of 789 years. The Zhou is usually split into two time periods, the Western Zhou of 1046 BC until 771 BC under the royal house of Ji, and the Eastern Zhou for a period of more than 500 years. Centralized power diminished during the Zhou dynasty due to the spring and autumn period and the warring states. Look out for more about these later in the video. During the warring states period, the Zhou royal court had very little control over its constituent states who were at war with each other. This ultimately led to the Qin state consolidating its power and forming the Qin dynasty in 221 BC after the formal collapse of the Zhou dynasty 35 years earlier. The historical period of the Zhou dynasty is considered the pinnacle of Chinese bronzeware, and the dynasty's latter period is famed for the origins of three major philosophies: Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism. Another milestone achieved during the Zhou dynasty was the evolving of written script from oracle and bronze script, first into seal script before the emergence of an archaic clerical script during the later era of the Warring States period. The foundation of the Zhou dynasty. There is a traditional myth in Chinese folklore that claims the Zhou lineage began with Jiang Yuan, a consort to the legendary Emperor Ku, who by some miracle conceived a child. Qi, or the Abandoned One, was a cultural hero who survived being left abandoned by his mother on 3 occasions, and in his adult life was credited with agricultural improvements. This led to his being granted the title of Haoji, Lord of Millet. His descendants settled at a place called Bin, where they ruled for generations. They later moved to an area in the Wei River Valley in what is today Qishan County, Shanxi Province. In 1046 BC, as vassals to the Shang kings, the Zhou ruler Wu, together with his ally Jiang Ziya, led an army that consisted of 45,000 men and 300 chariots across the Yellow River, where they defeated King Zhou of Shang at the Battle of Muya. This marked the beginning of the Zhou dynasty. The surviving Shang royal family were given the title of Song, with the Duke of Song being passed down each generation in a practice known as 2 kings, 3 reverences. The Western Zhou. The Western Zhou existed from 1045 until 771 BC, with its first ruler, King Wu, remaining at the old capital for ceremonial purposes, with a new palace constructed at Hao, located nearby. Wu's early death left the new dynasty with a young and inexperienced heir. King Cheng was assisted by his uncle, the Duke of Zhou, in consolidating power. An attempted rebellion, however, led to the expansion of the Zhou kingdom to the east. Over time, the decentralized system of rule became strained between the Zhou kings and the regional dynasties as relationships thinned over the following generations. Some of those outlying territories became almost as powerful and on par with the Zhou. There were conflicts with nomadic tribes to the north and northwest, known as Qianyun, Guifang, and a number of Rong tribes, including the Shirong, Shanrong, and Guanrong. These conflicts intensified towards the end of the Western Zhou period. Historians claim the tribes were harassing the Zhou territory, when often it was the Zhou attempting to expand northwards and encroaching on the traditional lands of those nomadic tribes. King Yo demoted and exiled his Jiang queen in favor of a commoner, Lao Ze. The demoted queen's father, the Marquis of Shang, joined with the Quanrong barbarians and sacked the Western Zhou capital of Haojin in 771 BC. With the last king, Yo, of the Western Zhou dead, nobles met at Shang and declared the Marquis's grandson as the new ruler, King Ping. The capital was moved east to Wangchang, and this marked the end of the Western Zhou and the beginning of the Eastern Zhou Dynasty. The Eastern Zhou, although it lasted more than 500 years, from 771 to 256 BC, was a period of a collapse of royal authority, although one of ritual importance for the royal family. The Confucian Chronicle during the early years of the Eastern Zhou labeled this the Spring and Autumn period. The partition of the state of Jin during the mid-5th century BC led to a second phase known as the Warring States. In the year 403 BC, the Zhou recognized the Han, Zhao, and Wei as fully independent states, with, in 344 BC, Duke Hui of Wei declaring himself the King of Wei. As other leaders followed his example, it marked a turning point as these leaders no longer considered themselves as vassals of the Zhou dynasty, regarding themselves as fully independent kingdoms, fell during various conflicts with the Zhou being a non-combatant in most conflicts. Traditionally, the final Zhou king is listed as being Nan, who died when the Qin captured the capital of Wenchang in 256 BC. A splinter state was declared under King Hui, but this was removed by 249 BC. The Qin unification of China concluded in 221 BC with the annexation of Qi by Qin Shi Huang. Despite their failings, the Eastern Zhou is remembered as a golden age of Chinese philosophy. The 100 schools of thought flourished as rival lords patronized itinerant Shi scholars such as Qi's Jixia Academy. The 9 schools of thought which became the most dominant were Confucianism, legalism, Taoism, Mohism, agriculturalism, diplomatists, logicians, militarists, and the naturalists. Although of these 9, only the first 3 listed went on to receive imperial patronage in later dynasties. The Mohis were later accepted not for their praise of meritocracy, but for the mastery of defensive siege warfare, while their arguments against nepotism were used in favor of establishing the imperial examination system. Mandate of Heaven and the justification of power. One of East Asia's most enduring political doctrines, the Mandate of Heaven, was introduced during the Zhou dynasty. The reasoning was that they asserted their moral superiority, and this was justification for taking over from the Shang. The Zhou further claimed that a mandate had been imposed upon them from heaven to replace the Shang and return good governance to the people. Therefore, the Mandate of Heaven was presented as a religious compact between the Zhou people and their supreme God in heaven. It was further agreed by the Zhou that worldly affairs would align with those of the heavens. The heaven conferred legitimate power on only one person, and that person was the Zhou ruler. In return, the Zhou ruler was duty-bound to uphold the principles of harmony and honor. Any ruler that failed in this duty, who let instability enter into earthly affairs or let his people suffer, would lose the mandate. Under this system, it was the prerogative of the spiritual authority to withdraw support from any wayward ruler and find another more worthy. In this way, the Zhou sky god legitimized any change of regime. The Zhou rulers themselves had to acknowledge they were even susceptible to being ousted if through improper practices they lost the mandate of heaven. Written during this period, the Book of Odes clearly intoned such caution. The Zhou kings claimed that their victory over the Shang was favoured by heaven, as the later Shang kings had been evil men with policies that brought pain to the people they governed through waste and corruption. Once the Zhou was in power, the mandate became a political tool. The royal calendar. One of the king's duties and privileges was to create a royal calendar. This official document defined the times that agricultural activities were undertaken in addition to the celebration of rituals. However, unexpected events such as solar eclipses or natural calamities also raised questions about the ruling house's mandate, as the rulers claimed their authority came from heaven. To counter such events, the Zhou went to great lengths to study the stars and to perfect the astronomical system upon which they based their calendar. Feudalism, Fengjian system, and bureaucracy. The Zhou Dynasty is often described by Western historians as being feudal because the Zhou's Fengjian system is compared to that of the medieval era in Europe. It's true there were some similarities between the two. Firstly, the conquered land, when the dynasty was first established, was divided into hereditary fiefs. These eventually became powerful in their own right. Another common trait was that the Zhou recognized matters of inheritance, where the oldest son of each generation formed the main line of descent and political authority. Younger brothers were moved out to establish new lineages of lesser authority. Within the Fengjian system, there were 5 ranks of peerage below the ranks of royalty. The closest English translations are Duke, Marquess, Count, Viscount, and Baron. At times, an ambitious duke would seize power from his nobles and centralize the state. This was particularly required when states went to war, and as more states began to fight among themselves, and this encouraged more warfare. Another difference between Chinese cities and medieval Europe was that Europeans ruled from castles, while the Zhou rulers were embedded inside walled cities. China at that time had a distinct class system, which saw Shang descent yeomen as masters of ritual and ceremony, a role covered by the clergy of Europe. The yeomen of Shang descent instructed astronomy, state affairs, and ancient canons, known as Ru. The hereditary classes were similar to knights in Western society in their status and breeding, although much more of a scholar than a warrior. Confucius was one of the most famous of these administrative clerks. Agriculture. During the Zhou dynasty, agriculture was very intensive and often directed by the government. All farming land was owned by nobles, and land was given to serfs to work this land, similar to the feudalism of Europe. Each piece of land was divided into 9 squares, with the crops from the central square given to the government, while the surrounding squares were kept by those that farmed the land. This system enabled the government to store any surplus which could be distributed in times of famine or poor harvest. Bronze was also smelted during this time, integral to making weapons and tools required for farming. This manufacturing industry was controlled by the nobility, who directed what materials were to be produced and when. Military. The early years of the Western Zhou were supported by a strong army split into 2 major units, the 6 armies of the West and the 8 armies of Zhou. They conducted campaigns in the northern Laos Plateau in what is today Ningxia, as well as the Yellow River floodplain. The military strength of the Zhou was at its peak during the 19th year of the reign of King Zhao. At this time, the 6 armies were wiped out together with the death of their king on a campaign along the Han River. The early Zhou kings were themselves warriors, leading their armies into battle. This was a period when the Zhou were constantly at war with barbarians. Later kings fared no better, King Li led 14 armies against barbarians from the south without achieving victory, while King Xuan fought against the Quanrong nomads. King Yo was killed by the Quanrong when they sacked the Zhou capital of Haojing. Chariots had first been used in China by the Shang dynasty, but it was the Zhou that first used them in battle. Chariots were introduced into China from Central Asia after being used by the steppe populations of the Saka and Wushan groups of Iranic people. The Zhou also adopted the fighting style, art motifs and myths of these nomadic people. While fighting some barbarians, the Zhou were also friendly with others, including the Dai people. King Hui of Zhou married a princess of the Red Dai, while King Shang of Zhou was also married to a Dai princess. Both marriages showed strong alliances between the Zhou and the Dai. The Spring and Autumn period and the Warring States. Within the time frame of the Zhou dynasty were two significant eras, those of the Spring and Autumn period, which was closely followed by the Warring States. The first of these, the Spring and Autumn period, occurred from 770 to 476 BC during the Eastern Zhou dynasty. It was a time when many of the vassal states pledging allegiance to the Zhou were fighting each other and competing for supremacy. During this era, the ruling imperial house slowly lost any diplomatic power and authority. Political and economic coalitions diminished, as did any accumulation of productive wealth. City walls were hastily built as protection against one another, as well as nomadic tribes. Merchants and artisans began to assume some levels of power as education and intellectual life advanced. The Warring States occurred from 475 to 221 BC, with 7 or more small feuding states within the Zhou dynasty fought to the end, as most of those vassal states were eventually conquered and the Qin found they were in overall control of what would become a unified China. Despite the era being a violent one, it was also an influential one, with the emergence of several great philosophers, as well as the establishing of many structures of government and culture that would characterize China in its next 2 millennia. Conclusion: what ultimately led to the downfall of the Zhou dynasty? For the answer to this question, you have to go back to the end of the Western Zhou, more than 500 years before the end of the Zhou dynasty. King Yo, in trying to please his concubine Baozi, led to a revolt which ended the Western Zhou and their being replaced by the Eastern Zhou. However, the Eastern Zhou, establishing their capital in Luoyang, never fully gained the power to control their vassal states. These vassals took to fighting among themselves as the Spring and Autumn period transpired into the Warring States period. The 7 major powers of this era led to the ultimate power in the state of Qin. A revolt between the dwindling Zhou and the Qin in alliance with other states saw first an attack by the Zhou. This was repelled, and when the Qin attacked the Zhou, the ruler surrendered, giving power to the Qin. The Qin then strengthened their base by conquering their neighbours and eventually uniting China. That is all for this video. If you have enjoyed watching and it has shown you a little detail of life here in China, then your subscribing to my channel would mean a lot to me. Thank you for watching. Make sure you click on the link to the next video, and until the next time, goodbye for now.